Hi everyone. So welcome to the video lecture for Tuesday, November 3rd. It's election day tomorrow in the United States of America, and I know many people might be a little bit distracted by the drama of the election. And I wanted today to try and weave together a few strands that are active in our class now and bring it all back to our reading, which have to do with interpretations that have come to us in the present day of ancient thought in the form of the Tao Te Ching. And we'll also be thinking about Zhuangzi, these two Taoist texts associated with two figures, Lao Tzu, who may or may not have been an actual individual, and Zhuangzi, who was indeed a documented individual. It's philosophical grounding that has proven to be very popular and useful to many who think about contemporary ecological problems, including the question of the Anthropocene. I mentioned the election not merely because the election of Donald Trump in 2016 was a shock to many, or because the prospective continuation of a Trump administration in the United States creates a lot of controversy within the United States and globally, but because we are, with regard to the Anthropocene, looking at a period of Earth history and human history that appear to be quite pivotal. In other words, with regard to many of the Earth system cycles that are being disrupted by human activity, most prominently perhaps the carbon cycle, CO2 emissions as a greenhouse gas, but also other cycles. As we enter this period where these are being thrown into a great deal of volatile disequilibrium with regard to their prior states during the Holocene, last 10,000 years or so, right? Political decisions and policies do take on a different weight. A political leadership and policy-making body that primarily seeks to deepen and extend the role that fossil fuels play in our lives by doubling down on or recommitting to coal, oil, and natural gas as the primary means of powering our economy and providing the abundant commercial and consumer goods that we obviously enjoy to a great degree. That approach is guaranteed to release more CO2 and methane into the atmosphere and into the oceans, into the hydrosphere, which is in turn, just scientifically, empirically, guaranteed to trap more solar radiation and to drive temperatures up. It's also guaranteed to increase the acidity of ocean water, endangering creatures that require a certain balance of acidity in the ocean in order to have things like shells or exoskeletons, things like plankton, coral, and other sea creatures and sea life that we take for granted as being part of the abundance and biodiversity of the world in which we live. So this is really an interesting period in which to be alive. Very, I think, interesting to think about without any partisan, political posturing or taking of sides or demonizing of any particular group of people or political party, etc., to recognize that human affairs are natural in that they influence the natural world, the non-human natural world, right? We're getting to this point where we're recognizing that we are not separate from, above, or beyond nature in any meaningful sense, empirically speaking. Set aside religious belief, set aside speculative, proposals that we have eternal souls or that we live in a world that is computer simulacrum or that we, whatever. This isn't somehow the world that we live in. It's not the real world. Set all that aside. None of that is provable. That's all theoretical, speculative. Empirically speaking, we are here. We are flesh and blood. We inhale and burn oxygen in combination with the food stuff that we consume to create energy in our bodies. We burn hydrocarbons to create energy, to fuel our automobiles and power our computers and, make toys for our children and so forth. And that process is has reached such an extent and intensity that it is disrupting cycles that we think of as natural. But of course, in the Anthropocene, the human is a force of nature on par with planet-shaping forces of, well, the past and the future. Long-term erosion, the impact of meteorites, volcanic activity at a high rate, tectonic plates shifting, shifts in the tilt of the Earth's axis relative to the sun. I could go on, but I won't. All I'm trying to do is point out to you that we're at a very interesting moment, right? China's 5-year plan, I believe, was recently updated, and Xi Jinping spoke about seeking to bring China into a carbon neutral economy by, I believe it was 2060. Correct me if I'm wrong. And China has indeed been a leader in many respects with the development of implementation of solar and to some extent not wind so much, but other technologies, including electric vehicles, that would arguably provide a pathway to a low emissions future with regard to CO2. There's lots of good news in the world, right? There's real progress, it would appear, according to media reports, on the production of fusion power, which could shift us to a hydrogen economy, a different kind of nuclear power, not nuclear fission, which creates a lot of radioactive waste, but nuclear fusion, which requires special technologies that we haven't mastered, but that is technologically, it seems possible, and that we might be able to shift our economies to in the future. We can suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. We have the ability to pull it out of the atmosphere and sequester that carbon or convert it to perhaps a useful fuel or material world. I guess in part what I'm doing is, as an American citizen at a Sino-American university, where the two leading economies of the 21st century come together, and at a time of real tension where it seems they might fly apart in ways that could be violent and destructive in historical terms, the systems we think about a lot, the economy, right? Military conflict, whether direct or proxy, run through other nations or other means. But we're, more importantly, I think, and this class, I hope, is bringing this home, in geological time. We're in Earth history time. And we're at a point where we, as a species, have an awareness of the fact that what we're doing and the way we're doing it is changing the world in ways that could be enormously destructive to the future of humankind and of many species with which we share the planet, a number of which are presently on the way to extinction, and a great many more which could also go extinct, which would not mean that we would just be leaving, humans functioning in some way independently of other species. We depend on them. We've co-evolved. We share the planet with them. And this is the real story of this class. The politics is important because we are a part of these larger natural systems. The policies are important because we are a part of these larger natural systems. The decisions that we make in our individual lives cumulatively add up to enormous consequences. So we do have power as individuals, especially as networked individuals, connected to all the other human beings on the face of the planet. This is my, Election Day message to you. And I'm going to end it by turning to the screen here and focusing momentarily on David Hinton's introduction to his classical Chinese poetry anthology, which includes the excerpts in translation from the Tao Te Ching that we read for last week. After that, I'll shift to talk a little bit about the reading for today and try to help you think about how and why we're studying Taoism in a class like this. So let's take a look. He writes here, and this is not a reading I've given you, I'll share this with you though. The Taoist cosmology that became the conceptual framework shared by all poets in the mature written tradition must have evolved together with language during the earliest stages of human culture in China, as they share the same deep structure, and it eventually found written expression in the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi. Taoist thought is best described as spiritual ecology. That word ecology is a big one for us, the central concept of which is Tao, or way. Tao originally meant way, as in pathway or roadway, a meaning it is kept, but Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi redefined it as a spiritual concept, using it to describe the process, hence a way, through which all things arise and pass away. To understand their way, we must approach it at its deep ontological level, and ontology, the ontological, is a philosophical concept for being, the study of being, where the distinction between presence, being, and absence, non-being, arises. Presence is simply the empirical universe, which the ancients described as the 10,000 living and non-living things in constant transformation, and absence is the generative void from which this ever-changing realm of presence arises. This is not a mystical realm in Hinton's view, and with regard to philosophical Taoism, as opposed to ritualized or religious Taoism. And this framework is an ontological description, Hinton argues, of natural process. Most obvious in the seasonal cycle, right? Spring, winter, summer, autumn. A cycle which is being disrupted, by the way, by climate change and anthropogenic disruption of other natural processes. So he's arguing here that this is empirical and that it's not a mystical thing, but rather a cosmology, a world picture, which is, in a sense, scientific. So he argues this is key. Although radically different from the Judeo-Christian worldview that has dominated Western culture, this Taoist cosmology represents a worldview that is remarkably familiar to us in the modern Western world. You know about part of the reason the poetry feels so contemporary. It is secular, non-religious, and yet profoundly spiritual. It is thoroughly empirical, and I want to emphasize this, and basically accords with, and here's the kicker, modern scientific understanding. It is deeply ecological, weaving the human into the, quote, natural world in the most profound way. Indeed, the distinction between human and nature is entirely foreign to it. Let's stop there. That's the point that I really want to drive home. And so the human affairs of thinking about an election in the United States, whether or not you're an American, is not abstracted from above or beyond the natural world. It's integral to it. And the outcomes from this kind of an election and what people do in response to whatever those outcomes might be are not just economic, they're not just political, they're not just ideas, they're not just matters of what we think, feel, or believe, and they're not just material in the sense of GDP or whether or not you're financing a particular construction project. Rather, they are part of whether or not this planet will shift and change in one way or another way, whether certain things will arise or fall away, whether certain species will continue or go extinct. And this is the question of the Anthropocene. We'll dig deeper into this moving forward.